And then it kind of like, now I'm here, so it's like, Zhongong. Hi. Glad to have you all here. I think we're going to start.
Yeah, we're going to start.
Yeah.
Welcome to the PCC Forum. This is our first event of the semester. Welcome to be here. And Natalie has some introductions of our presenters.
So we have Joshua here. So Joshua works and performs internationally as a metamorphosis ecologist, most recently in Santiago, Chile for a knowledge culture ecologies conference. And in the Bay Area, he teaches children gardening, sells local raw honey, and is a founding guide at Watershed Witness Tours, where he reconnects Bay Area residents with their local drinking water sources. And his music project is called Home House, which will have its debut album arriving before 2020, right?
That's it.
Okay.
So.
And he has his BFA from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts and his MA from the Integral Ecology Track in the PCC program. So welcome, Joshua.
Oh, hi. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be, I'm honored to be inaugurating the Spring's Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness Forum. I will go through a whole bunch of things over the next probably hour and 20 minutes. And I will, hopefully, we'll be able to orient each other as we go. I want to begin by saying I've been feeling a lot of gratitude for how amazing it is to live in the Bay Area this week, especially because this is an estuary that gives birth to new life. It has been since before folks like us lived here, but that is often really feels really vital and present when the weather is so dynamic, like it's been, especially this week. We actually had snow on some of the East Bay Hills and on Mount Tam and Mount Diablo, which is pretty rare. And I'm from New Jersey, and I come from, on my father's side, Carpathian mountain winter stock. So I'm into the snow. And Misha and I drove along the Skyline Boulevard above Oakland and Berkeley to like try to find snow. And I just love kind of playing with the weather that way. And there's kind of a dance of rainbows and sort of air and wetness and all the elements. And the snowpack accumulating in the Sierras, that's hugely good news for this season's watersheds. I'm also like really excited about the freshman women of color in Congress and all the, there feels like there's such a potent sort of potentiality that's showing up right now. I guess I'm front loading some of these kind of like optimistic, maybe brighter aspects of what's going on right in the present, in part because we're intending to go through some seriously grim, intense, you could say pretty fucked up things tonight. That's part of why I wanted to set the space, is to be able to kind of go there and also to be able to go there together, and then also to bring ourselves back, or at least include what we're exploring as we go on. So yeah, there's some of these heartbreaking issues that we're going to go through cry out for holding in a community vessel, and so that's why I'm grateful for you guys to be able to host this tonight. And at the same time, I want to sort of bring in there that we're just going to be together for about 2 hours. So some of this, if it's really intense, please also take care of yourself. Trust your boundaries, your own bodies, your yeses and your nos as we go. There's going to be opportunities for movement and hand holding, like kind of literal, like boop 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 hand holding. But everything's optional, and please feel free, absolutely welcome to participate as much or as little as feels right to you. And that includes also the folks in here, this area here. And I'll be including you all in, don't fall over, Al. I gotcha. We'll be including all of us as we go. So just a little bit more about my background and how I became involved with this community. I went through the integral ecology track, which to my understanding is a precursor to the ecology, spirituality, and religion department. And while I was there, the primary stuff that I found myself coming back to and studying and really sort of compelled by over the course of the program was the ways that our home is transforming, and home as small or as large as all of us want to include. Another thing that I was studying was solastalgia, which is the homesickness that one experiences as our homes are disappearing around us. So that can be as quick as like, oh, there's a fire coming in, we got to get out. Or it could be really slow, sort of piecemeal, like you notice some changes and you notice that things that you thought were going to be continuing aren't able to continue. And so that can show up in a lot of ways. And I think some of us were experiencing some of that solastalgia in relationship to the wildfires this last, in the fall, because the smoke was blanketing the whole area, and it felt so oppressive, and the knowledge that these were places that were no longer could exist in the same way, and all of that drifting this way. So let's see, so solastalgia is one of the new portmanteau words that we're going to be using tonight. Another one is bioreavement, which is just bio and bereavement. And I want to also say, as we go, that I'm really into kind of new utterances. I am interested in the way that language transforms as we sort of find new ways of expressing. And at the same time, I want our language to feel inclusive and not alienate anyone. I had a workshop that actually, I'm trying to get my sleeve out of there. If you were wondering what I'm up to. I had a workshop that I did a few times at Burning Man actually once that was called That Sounds Crazy. And the subtitle was Skillfully Sharing Our Shifting Planet. And so I'm very open to feedback for if any of the language resonates with you or rubs you the wrong way, please let me know. Also, we're going to be, as we go, we will, please feel free to ask questions, make comments. Hopefully there'll be more time toward the end to be able to get into longer form discussion and longer questions. But I want this to be a community sense making, so we can engage together that way. So we are going to be, I'll just finish by giving a little bit more context of where I'm coming from, which is I use this integral ecology degree every day. As a garden teacher, it's all about ways that we relate between humans and the planet. So all the seasons that come through and the ways that the kids are able to love those intimate, like plucking fruit from the tree and knowing exactly when these seasons end and the next fruit trees come on. And like, I didn't have anything like that growing up until much later. So I think it's helpful for that generation, especially, to have the opportunity to fall in love with the planet before they actually realize how much trouble it's in. And same thing with the honey farm. There's interconnections between the bees and the larger ecosystems and how they're doing. They're an indicator species, and not just honeybees too, but all the other wild pollinators. And I do, as Natalie said, watershed tours. And so I'm getting people in touch with their local drinking water sources. And that's been amazing. And it involves going up into the mountains usually and camping overnight at the headwaters and seeing all the stretch of the river that we rely on. So those will be starting up again in the spring. But there's going to be a lot of waterfalls and gushing, bursting, splashing up there because it's so much snow accumulating now. Okay, so we're going to go through a number of cherished myths that we're going to try to break open a little bit. We're doing this under the sort of overarching rubric, this kind of cosmos of climate collapse. And from that ground, even though it's a shifting ground, we're going to be looking at things like urgency and efficacy and safety and even the futility of it all being totally fucked. And we'll face these one at a time, about 10 or 12 minutes each, maybe 15, or, it depends how much we are getting into it, And then these will be somewhat demarcated by opportunities to get out of our seat and move our bodies, as well as a couple short guided meditations. We're going to have about 5 opportunities to get out of our seats. I'm telling you now, in part because we're playing with anticipation and dread tonight, that one of the 5 movements, only one, will be abrupt and disruptive. The rest of them will be gentle and supportive. If abrupt and disruptive is not your jam for tonight, don't do it. It's all good. Like, you'll be able to tell. It's only gonna. We'll all keep it to just a few seconds. We'll agree to doing that, and you'll be able to tell it's starting because I'm gonna go what, and that'll be it. So you'll see. But participate again as much or as little as you want. In the meantime, there are a handful of questions that we're trying to ask together. Certain themes are likely to recur, and we'll get deeper into paradigms and paradoxes that arise around the questions of whether or not we're fucked. We'll examine avoidance, paralysis, the ideas behind complicity, blame, atonement, sacrifice and relinquishment, entitlement and worthiness, scaling down, slowing down, self-care, and hashtag self-care. I am a millennial technically. I'm like on the elder cusp of the millennials, so I get to hashtag. I'll offer a new song called "Avoid Dance," and then we'll close with some questions that I have for you after that. So yeah. Also, I just want to clarify before we begin that I won't be leaning very heavily on the climate data. Personally, I have very little appetite for convincing folks that the climate is changing drastically in ways that we haven't experienced before. I think it's a good question and one that we can bring up here on what to do with folks who are digging down into their willful ignorance. But I'm here working with the idea that we're all kind of somewhat in agreement that things are, that if you look at the data and you keep up with it and you keep checking back on it, that it seems to be trending towards worse and sooner. Okay. This is a quote that we'll start, and we'll have a number of quotes. I will try to weave them in elegantly if possible. This is a quote from Pema Chodron, who's the principal Buddhist teacher at Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia, and comes from the lineage of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Is that right? Yeah, okay, great. Pema Chodron, we don't set out to save the world. We set out to wonder how other people are doing and to reflect on how our actions affect other people's hearts. So that's a good expression of, from my perspective, some of what we're intending to do here tonight. Okay, are you guys ready to get out of your seats the first time? Cool. So here's what we're going to do. This is called membrane making, and it's a good start because it allows us to establish our boundaries. So stand up, hold your arms, if you will, out in this way. And basically, I want you to trace your membrane, the outer boundaries of your body and your energy. And you can bring it in, you can have it up, you can have it low, you can use your legs and your feet. And I want you to do, while you're feeling that, first of all, don't strain yourself or hurt yourself. Maybe it feels good, that might be good, but don't push it too far, just the right amount. And while you're doing that, feel both the distinction of sort of the outsideness, the outer world, everybody else, everything else that's happening, all the stuff that's happening, it's out there beyond your hands. And you're able to only let in what you want right now. And same thing with the energy that you put out. You, through your hands and through all of the things that you choose, all the choices that you make, are able to put energy out in the world. But right now you're able to make the distinctions, to be mindful, to be curious about those boundaries. And I know there's some of us, myself included, who are kind of into we're not ever really separate, we're all interdependent, you can't disconnect us from each other, and our bodies are dependent on all the microorganisms and microbiome that we rely on, and they're dependent on all the bodies of water and food and land that we are nested within. And at the same time, there are ways that we are, in our experience, separate at times, and independent, and able to establish our own space. So that's all I wanted to do. Hopefully that allows us to sort of bring ourselves here a little bit more, in ourselves, wherever we are. Okay, you guys can sit down. Thank you for doing that with me. So, let's get into it a little bit. When I started here at CIIS in 2010, a lot of folks were saying this is the last decade we get to make a change, to be able to affect what's happening, all the big transformations that are happening on the planet. We're going to have to get it together this decade and do rapid changes. And the decade is 10 months and 3 weeks from being done. So I don't know that that's truly the last little tiny shutting window of chance to make a difference. Of course, because I don't know all the things that go into that. But I have the feeling that the newest IPCC report, which gave us 12 years, gave us till 2030, feels optimistic. And also, there's a lot of different interconnected forces that play on each other. But just to do an example of some numbers around the fires that we just experienced. There were 9,000 separate fires in California. 5 of the worst in 2017, only broken by the fires of 2018. That's just our little region. Yes?
Keep going.
Did that go off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep going.
All right. So if you zoom out globally, there are up to 600,000 people that die from smoke inhalation every year, all around the world. So our being blanketed by all that smoke and sort of reading on our phones that it was the worst air quality in the world for a number of days, I didn't die there. And there were people that died in the fires. And we'll get into a little bit about some of those ways of understanding it, those distinctions. Let me know if there's anything I can do, Matt.
Pretend it's not happening.
Okay, cool.
We'll keep working on it.
Okay. So there's going to be a larger cluster of these intense numbers, but when I'm saying that 600,000 people died from smoke inhalation or any of this, please try to breathe and be present. They're huge numbers and also individual people. And so trying to sort of hold both of that and also not lose your shit is a big deal. So I respect all of you just showing up and trying to be present with it in whatever way that you need to be. Or numb out if that's what you need to also. Like, I get it. All of these are understandable responses. So there were 100,000 fires. We had 9,000 fires. There were 100,000 fires in the Amazon in 2017. The graphs of pollution and population and consumption and waste and all the things, they're all hockey stick graphs. They're all going zoop. And so anything that goes like that is not a sustainable direction. Okay. So that's just a little bit of an establishment there. If you follow that to, some of the further conclusions, then you start getting into things like, did it go? Oh, that's great. So that's a good step. It's okay. You'll work it out. Deep adaptation is just last year. This Professor Jem Bendell, is taking the data to its unbearable conclusions, and he is basically saying, "Hey guys, given all that's happening, collapse seems inevitable. Societal collapse. So, I mean, not just ecological collapse, but that we are not getting it together, that we are not handling it, implies that it's coming soon." So he says collapse is inevitable, catastrophe is possible, as probable, catastrophe is probable, and extinction as possible. All mass extinction. We know that there's a mass extinction underway. I really want to pause for that, because that's not just some animals and not just some loved ones, but all of our lives. Extinction is like all of us sniped out, cut off, right? That feels pretty, for me, that feels pretty impossible to be present with. One of my learned strategies is to come back on the blessing of radical uncertainty. And that gets to finding, as Carolyn Casey, who's an activist astrologer and word witch, she reminds us to find the blessing in the curse. I think near-term human extinction is wishful thinking, because I think we're harder to get rid of than that, frankly. We're kind of tenacious. But again, this is just my opinion. And my opinion is just one opinion in the whole sort of ocean of how we're working on this. And I think that's part of the point. When you have all these tipping points, when you have all these multiplier effects, you get into something where you understand when Donna Haraway calls our time not the Anthropocene, but the Cthulhucene, which references Cthulhu, which is the multi-tentacled monstrous beast emerging from the deep with all of the full sort of repercussions that are so much beyond and unbelievable to our little furry bodies, but are actually what drives the world and drives the universe. And we'll get a little bit more into Donna Haraway next. Okay. So the first paradigm, privileged paradigm, assumption, myth that we're going to get to is urgency. And again, I'm not saying that any of these are bad or dumb or like why wouldn't you want to agree that things are urgent, because then you have common cause and things to get behind. But they're very different depending on who you are and where you come from and what you're doing and what choices you have available to you. So I'm going to start with a quote by Greta Thunberg from Davos last month, which some of you may have read, which was, Adults keep saying we owe it. She's, I think, 15. Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire. Because it is. I was so frustrated that nothing was being done about the climate crisis. And I felt I had to do something, anything, and sometimes not doing things, like just sitting down outside the parliament, which is what she did, speaks much louder than doing things. Just like a whisper is sometimes louder than shouting. So it's easy, I think, especially in this room, for us to get to urgency. I imagine all of us have some agreed upon urgencies. And also we're absolutely allowed to have our own primary urgencies and emergencies around, let's say, healthcare or income or interpersonal relationships, which is one of my faves to spend time on. And these continue, understandably, to take precedent over the longer term tribulations that we're confronting as a species. Not that they can be separate. But even when these major events hit close to home, when, for instance, my mother's city is hit by a hurricane, or the region that I live in is blanketed by smoke, the developing pattern of monitoring urgency, that kind of hypervigilance that shows up, seems to come down to questions like, okay, but is my mom's building okay? Okay, there's fires in California. Is Josh's town on fire? Is Josh's place on fire? And if not, then it's urgent, but to me, I have my own urgencies around it. I have my own ways of relating to it. So we're going to get into a cluster of urgencies here. This will be the densest pack of like hard things to let in. I'm going to have an urgency too, because I want to be included in this group of urgencies, because we have to decide what to do and how to share our limited resources, all of that. Try to be equitable. I also want to say, in reference to clusters, clusters are complicated things. We are clustered on the planet. We are overcrowded on the planet. And figuring out how to share space is not an easy task. Also, the universe seems to group itself in clusters and in superclusters. And we'll get a little bit into that too. But there are lots of places where there's lots of lights, lots of stars, lots of galaxies, all jammed together, doing their thing, having their relationships. And then there's big voids across the space and time, where there's not much going on, or at least not much that we can visibly see or understand from our perspective. Okay, so in these clusters of urgencies, I just want you to watch your bodily responses as we go through them. They could be overwhelming, they could be unbearable, they could be like, I can't let that in. It's all good. Just watch where you are. You are also welcome, though I'm not going to encourage you, to rank them if you want, if it feels important to have this suffering be more suffering than that suffering. I don't think that's necessarily the right way to go, but we all have our ways of putting hierarchies into our lives. Okay, my urgency are urgent sea urchins in Nova Scotia, and they are being overfished for sushi in Japan, and weird American chefs are making sea urchin cappuccinos with, I think, like cauliflower cream and like creme fraiche or whatever. Like, okay, that's mine. Urgent sea urchins. Okay? So, here are some others. There are we can speak of the urgency for the Winnemem Wintu people up in Mount Shasta, who already, when the Shasta Dam went up in the 40s, lost a good deal of their villages, their sacred spaces, their cultural history. And now they're fighting again with the Trump administration, who wants to build the dam even higher. And they are doing every year a salmon run where they pilgrimage and encourage the salmon who they consider their family, and who are also having their populations collapse. They do a prayer. They guide them up the river, because the salmon start at the top of the river, and their bodies change, and they go out into the ocean. and they have their ocean life, and then at a certain point they go, okay, it's time, and their bodies change back, and they swim, if they can, all the way up back to where they were born, and they give their bodies back to the earth, back to the forests up there. Okay, so 60% of wildlife were wiped out in the last 40 years. We have 200 species that went extinct today. So that's two things. That's the actual living animals that were killed, and 200 species a day that are actually not coming back. So for them, that's emergency. That's no joke, like done full on. Included in our animal considerations, there are 60 billion animals killed on land and sea for our food every year. That's not counting vivisections or fur or hunting or shelters, all that stuff. There are 8 chickens for every person now because of the industrial food. They're the most prolific animal on the planet. I also want to say that at the school garden where I work, we had a chicken die yesterday. It's the first time in a couple of years. Ritz. It wasn't Goldie. There's 3 gold chickens, and I thought it was the other one. But they have just a little comb. One had a bigger comb, and one had a littler comb. And they live a long life at the school garden. And so she was like 7 or 8, which is pretty old for a chicken. And the kids gathered around, and we had a little funeral. And it was really sweet and sad. And then once the kids went down, I was cooping the chickens. And there's one other gold one that had been cuddling with her sister and now didn't want to coop and was waiting for her to show up. And it was really heartbreaking. And that was just last night as I was gathering all this weird stuff about chickens, because both the human and the chicken population have gone like that. Okay. We could get into things like the urgency between each 98 seconds that a person is sexually assaulted in this country. They're 90% often women. They're 1.2% more likely to be trans women of color. They're 2 times more likely to be disabled. We could get into the 1,000 people that were shot by police last year in the US. We could get into the 4 environmental activists that were murdered a week around the world in 2017. I'm an environmental activist, but no one is trying to kill me currently. But there's places all over the world, in Central America, in the Philippines, where it's full on taking your life into your hands, showing up, trying to stop dams, trying to stop industrialization. And then, thank you for continuing to breathe with me. There's some suicides that we can get into. There's 25 veteran suicides a day that are reported. There was the Tunisian fruit vendor Mohamed Bouazizi who set himself on fire, and that sparked the Arab Spring in almost a dozen countries now towards the beginning of the decade. There were 150 Tibetans who self-immolated since 2009 in protest of what's happening with Tibet and China. There are 199,132 Indian farmers who committed suicide between 1997 and 2008 because they had no other option for continuing the viability of growing food where they were and supporting their family and being able to survive. Another example is, there's 2 more, and then I'll kind of move through. The Fukushima 50, I wanted to mention. Those are the workers who went right in as the meltdown was happening, knowing that they would start getting thyroid cancer first, and still did all the work to try to close it up to prevent people from other people from getting exposed. And there is the story of What's that guy's name? David Buckell. Do you guys remember him? He set himself on fire in Prospect Park in Brooklyn last year. And he left a note that said, "My early death by fossil fuels reflects what we are doing to ourselves. A lifetime of service may best be preserved by giving a life. Honorable purpose in life invites honorable purchase in death. I hope it is an honorable death that might serve others. I apologize to you for the mess." Okay, that's my cluster. It's our cluster. It's clearly something that we're all, I don't want to say allowing to happen, but it's ongoing. And those are some deep urgencies. And I love my urgent sea urchins. And I want them to have the full potential of their little sea urchin lives. But if I say this is urgent and I'm able to draw resources and agency from other people, there's a lot of complex decisions that have to be worked through in there. At what stage does surrender still open new doors? When does ruin renew? Who gets to make the call when it's too late? Each spark in the dark lights until it doesn't. This is one of the things I said in my graduation from here. Who would tell the last blade of grass on the planet, that the single last blade of grass representing life on Earth, that it doesn't deserve its own share of soil and light and water so that it might thrive? You'd say, "No, blade of grass, you're the last one. It's too late. Give up, shrivel and die. Let's be totally dead." No, you would want it to keep growing. You would want it to sprout little flowers, see what it can do, see if it can attract if there's an insect out there that might want to pollinate. Okay. This is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. from Why We Can't Wait. The conservatives who say, "Let us not move so fast," and the extremists who say, "Let us go out and whip the world," would tell you that they are as far apart as the poles. But there's a striking parallel. They accomplish nothing. For they do not reach the people who have a crying need to be free. This is another one from that same. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to work to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively, in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. This appeal to freedom and liberation are ones we will hear throughout our quotes here tonight, and they cut to the very heart of the choices we understand to be available to us. Urgency and agency seem at first glance pitted against each other. Ought and owe and own originate from the same root. And such obligations cut into both freedom-cherishing folks like you and me, as well as freedom-loving Americans who insist on urgency that all over the world denies other people their agency, and not just their agency, but their right to life. A major fear of climate scientists around this has been they've been attempting for 40 years to warn, except they worry whether expressing urgency will be overwhelming and backfire. And it tends to do that. Shaking someone and screaming that your way of life is killing everything on the planet is not effective. The climate deniers are rapidly switching from "it's not happening" / "it's not man-made" to "it's too late and it's too far away yet to do anything about, we don't want to mess up the economy," all of that. You guys hear that all the time, I'm sure. So why do folks double down on willful ignorance and denial? Why do they revel in sports team-like savagery against each other? As I'm sure you are aware, the whole corporate enterprise from the Virginia Company, which founded this country, it's founded on genocide. It's founded on slaughtering whoever we want and forgetting about them. And the winners still believe that they currently run shit, and they are destroying the civilization with which they overran the planet. And I expect they seem to be willing to kill every last living being before yielding power to anybody not like them or who looks like this. Donna Haraway, our ecofeminist consciousness studies professor, emeritus, lays out a very stark and effective distinction for folks who are around right now. She describes the born ones and the disappeared. The born ones include the post-World War II generations, the industrial animals, the explosion of high-consuming pets, the explosion of the extractionist, high-consuming human populations of the earth, and the immiseration of the poor on the one hand. On the other hand are the vast numbers of the disappeared. This is the missing generation of those who experienced genocides, the disappearance among the species whose numbers have been so reduced or have been simply wiped out, the billions upon billions of the disappeared. She says, I don't think the born can be thought apart from the disappeared. So thinking about population can't just be a statistical number game. It is thinking who lives and who dies and how in this world of forced growth dire realities, which is one of my favorite new words. Multi-generation communities of compost calling out that it's not too late. When she spoke in the city last year, 2 years ago, I asked her about being in cahoots across different scales of body and home, and she kind of was like, and countered that the peacemaking and placemaking is certainly part of what we're doing. She doesn't want to focus only on the life-affirming aspects because she wants to include death in everything that we're involved in. So it's got to be both for her. Sherry Mitchell, an indigenous rights activist and teacher from the Penobscot Indian Reservation in Maine, warns that we must wake from the illusion of consumption and references the dance of the cannibal giant Wabanaki. This is a similar person in this lineage to the Wendigo of the Algonquins in upstate New York. And my understanding of this cannibal giant, and you can let me know too, your understanding too, is that it feeds on greed and overconsumption. And the idea is that the task of the Wendigo or this being is to protect the Earth Mother. And so once he is awakened, he infects humanity with the illness of endless consumption. And so they consume faster and faster and faster and more than the Earth Mother can produce. And so it quickens the pace until our dance becomes frenzied all the way to self-destruction. And so clearly he is awake, we are infected, and the way out is for us to wake up. There's an old Georgian tribal curse, which I've received via Orphan Wisdom School Stephen Jenkinson, which is, would that your last elder dies before your loneliness comes to you. Do you guys catch that? Would that your last elder dies before your loneliness comes to you. Yeah, it sort of goes to the this delusion of separation and not realizing it until it's too late. Bio-Okomolafe from the Emergency, the Emergence, I think it's the Emergence Network. I wrote Emergency Network, but that kind of works too. He says, it is not only bodies that melt into other bodies in the Anthropocene. Time itself is shorn of its noble disinterestedness, and the past and the future touch each other. In fact, the presumed linearity and unidirectionality, making the past contemporaneous with the present and resituating the future with the present and the past in the thick now. Time folds and melts in the Anthropocene the way taffy folds in on itself in the levers of a machine. His people, the Yoruba people, speak of circular time, slushy time, or time that collapses on itself. There are no arrows of time that fly forward in Yoruba indigenous imagination. None of the incessant tick-tocking that has fueled progress, that has become the soundtracks of our busy, delimited lives. In his work, A Slower Urgency, We Will Dance with Mountains, he says, so everywhere I was invited to speak, I offered an invitation to slow down, which seems like the wrong thing to do when there's fire on the mountain. But here's the point. In hurrying up all the time, which we are always encouraged to do, we often lose sight of the abundance of resources that might help us meet today's most challenging crises. We rush through into the same patterns we are used to. Of course, there isn't a single way to respond to crisis. There's no universally correct way. However, the call to slow down brings us to face with the invisible, the hidden, the unremarked, the yet to be resolved. Sometimes what is the appropriate thing to do is not the effective thing to do. Tema Okun, from Showing Up for Racial Justice, lists urgency as a characteristic assumption of white supremacy culture, used to create norms within organizations and strategies which include continued sense of urgency that makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive, as Bio said. Encourage democratic and or thoughtful decision-making, to think long-term, to consider consequences frequently, and it frequently results in sacrificing potential allies for quick and highly visible results. For example, sacrificing interests of communities of color in order to win victories for white people who are seen as the default or norm community, and mostly represented here. Just saying. Reinforced by funding proposals which promise too much work for too little money, and by funders who expect too much for too little. The antidotes to this include realistic work plans, leaderships which understand that things take longer than anyone expects, discussions and plans for what it means to set goals of inclusivity and diversity, particularly in terms of time, and learning from past experience how long things take, writing realistic funding proposals and realistic time frames, and being clear how to make good decisions in the atmosphere of urgencies. Okay, we've gotten to our first treat of the evening. This is chocolate, and it's 100% cacao with no sugar, but there's coconut on there. Feel free to have it or not if you want.
Does everybody else get?
Yeah, you don't have to talk for you. You have to pass it along. You don't have to, but then we have to talk about what you're doing and make it a whole thing.
Did you say you made this?
No, I did not make that one. It's a tease for the one that I made, which is coming around a little later. Chocolate, guys. Chocolate is one of the ones that may not be here forever.
As long as we get coffee, right?
Funny you mentioned that, Matt. Coffee is also one of the ones that may not be here. Now, I could go without coffee before chocolate. That's just a personal thing. I don't know if that's true for everybody. I feel like if the doctor said this is just that scenario, it was like you can't eat chocolate chip cookies anymore. I'd be like, I'm not sure that I'm gonna hang out then. But and I might want to stash chocolate if it's really not gonna make it. But how can you deal with horrible news if the horrible news is losing one of the best ways to deal with horrible news? That's part of what comes up with that. Yes, I will have a bite. Yes, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, do we miss Ari? Ari, did you get chocolate? Nope. 360-degree camera. 360-degree chocolate. Do you want chocolate?
Oh.
Yeah. Nom, nom. Ari, would you like?
Oh, thank you so much.
Oh yeah, strong. I wanted to get like the full-on cacao kind of. No, cacao, girl. Go ahead, cacao.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for catching that one. Okay.
Thank you.
The reason, I'll just say thank you. Please excuse my chocolate mouth. The reason the chocolate is in danger is because there are fungal diseases, and climate change is affecting the few places that chocolate grows. It currently grows in the Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Indonesia. And there's not a ton of other places that chocolate can easily grow. They're talking about using CRISPR to modify the chocolate genes. seems odd. I don't know anything about that, but it seems intense. And we'll get into the other possibilities of what we might do locally when that happens. But we've come to our second standing upness. You guys ready? Okay. Check it out. So, this one, we are all going to be trees in a forest. And I want you to stand fingertip distance apart. Okay. So you can kind of graze each other's hand.
In a circle or?
Yeah, not in a circle, because it's a forest. So you're all, I don't want to say competing for light, but you're all working it out. Okay. Are you good? I mean, your forest is clearly still growing. That looks about right. This seems good. Is this off again?
It apparently turns off after 25 or 30 minutes.
Curious.
Is there like a setting?
I probably need to play with that.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's not.
Okay. I'll turn that way.
Lights on in here.
But we're going back live in a second.
Yeah.
All right. So, your head, let's say your shoulders end up, are above ground. So this is the above ground part of the tree. Everything below ground are the roots and the mycological networks. So your hands and your arms and your fingers and your toesies, those are all the mushroom networks. Not the fruiting above ground part, but all the networks underneath talking to each other. One of the amazing things about having a forest like this is they communicate with each other through those mycological networks. So, Matt, will you do me a favor?
Yes.
I'm going to be like a beetle, something that is kind of interested in eating some of you trees. So I'm gonna start nibbling on you. Oh, sorry, that was a little pinchy. I'm gonna start nibbling on you, and you come up with some kind of way to let the tree next to you know that there's a beetle nibbling. So like I'm gonna start nibbling. You come up with a hand gesture to your friend, and then you pass that on, so that it will ripple through the whole place. Okay? No, I mean, sorry. That works like that. I think that's a convincing human gesture. But I mean something like squeeze, like give a squeeze or like a pull or like a scratch, something, and then you can all pass it along.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh. And then will you pass one to the owl? And then you guys at home can pass it back. It'd be part of our forest.
Just say, give us chocolate.
Oh, okay. Chocolate. No, we're being trees right now. We got past that. Okay, now I'm going to be a forest fire. So you have to come up with, if you can tell all the other trees in the forest in time, then they can release enough sap so that they'll counteract the forest fire. Okay? Oh, you're dead, but you guys released all the sap, so just Matt died. And the forest is saved. Okay, thank you, Forest. You did great. Yeah, thank you, Matt, for your sad forest demise. Okay. So, thank you guys for doing that. So, we're trying to let go of effectiveness tonight. Why is that? Why would we don't we want to be effective? Okay, well, my understanding is we can never know if we're effective. I mean, you can do everything as perfectly as you possibly can, and you intend it to be the most, enormously important work that will save the most amount of beings, and you just don't know. At what point does something become effective? One of the first places I heard this was with Joanna Macy, who is our resident eco-activist elder and started in the anti-nuclear world, but has been developing planetary hospice and grief work now for decades. And she says, don't believe anyone who tells you how it'll turn out. It is not our knowing, it is in our not knowing that we are most in touch with our compassion and our interconnectedness. Isn't that so? So she's encouraging us to let go of effectiveness because we never know what effect we have. Stephen Jenkinson, who is one of our death guides in this time, his most recent book is Come of Age, It's a Case for Elderhood. He offers this sense of time as a spiral. You are granted another chance to befriend your days and what they've made of you. Consider this grace, the first time these things swam towards you, or the fifth, none of them were your one and only chance to get it right. They were not. This is not fate, nor is it doom. This is mercy, carried to you by these days of yours, days not lost by coming around again. So we're talking about scales of effectiveness. We're talking about, we all have our hands and what we can do with our hands. And we have what we can do with our voices. It ripples out in that way. Also, it can become controlling. People can get into obsessive compulsiveness. I think all of us have that to some degree. And then it can also go into the other side, which is that if we're fucked, you can switch over into nihilism. You can decide that the only solution is something like green fascism, where we're forcing everybody to give up their cars and their planes and all of that. This thing about control, it's in part, I'm not saying it's exclusively a white guy thing, but it's certainly something that we are, as people of this persuasion, kind of are obsessed with it in certain ways, or can be. And so part of my understanding about my own role is about stepping back and not trying to be in control and not trying to be sort of the dominating father, which clearly is an archetype that is exploding in front of us pretty dramatically. And I want to say there's a difference between visible and invisible work. There's a difference between receiving credit and not receiving credit. And there was an owl actually on a foggy evening that we had a little baby owl that was fledgling, and we had watched her grow up for a month in the Berkeley Hills. And then on this foggy day, foggy evening, she crawled out on the branch and she took off and we didn't see her again. It's like, okay, right. It's an owl. They're supposed to be mysterious and hidden. And she kind of reminded me at that time around invisibility, around not necessarily having to be the person with the pointing at myself. Okay. Ursula K. Le Guin, who's another hugely important elder in this work, and we'll be quoting her a few times. She says the thing about working with time instead of against it is that it is not wasted, that every pain counts. It's also a reminder of Josh Fox's most recent documentary, How to Let Go of the World and Love All the Things Climate Can't Change, which I love as an idea, and I'm really interested in that question of what climate can't change. Another white guy, in this case, who I want to read a little bit of a lengthier section here, is Charles Eisenstein, and this is from an article on the scale in the story of interbeing. This is a logic that he says he had grown up with and that he's working on figuring out how to let go of. There is no time to this is the logic. There's no time to indulge in small, insignificant solutions that will be swept away by the tsunami of climate change, economic meltdown, nuclear holocaust, scarcity-fueled wars, and so forth. We need big solutions to big problems. Therefore, whatever you do on a local level, you better make sure it's scalable. You better make sure it can go viral, because otherwise its impact will be trivial. Contained within this logic is an implicit hierarchy that values the contributions of some people and some kinds of people more than others. It values the activities of people who have a big reach, a big platform, a loud voice, or the money or institutional power to affect thousands or millions of people. That valuation is, you may notice, nearly identical to the dominant culture's allocation of status and power, a fact that should give us pause. And he says, even though the logic seems unquestionable, it devalues the grandmother spending all day with her granddaughter, the gardener restoring just one small corner of earth to health, even if they're not making a video about what they're doing in the garden. He's referring to as the theory of change that underlies the ambition to do a big thing, to scale up to reach millions, which at its roots is a Newtonian cosmology that says that change only happens when a force is exerted upon a mass. Moral philosophers have grappled for several centuries with a dispiriting corollary that what you do doesn't matter. For example, no matter how much you conscientiously recycle and conserve, your individual actions won't make a difference. It takes millions of others doing the same, and if millions of others do it, then it doesn't matter if you do or not. Philosophers have advanced various moral and ethical principles to countermand that logic, which is on its own terms unassailable. Foremost among them is, I guess, Kant's categorical imperative: act in the way you would want everyone to act in that situation, which is an idea that's popular in morality today. Don't dump poison down the drain, because even though it won't matter if you do it, if everyone thought that way, it would matter. But underneath that morality lies a secret nihilistic fear. Yeah, but not everyone thinks that way. Actually, it doesn't matter what I do. We have another source of knowledge that holds the small personal actions sacred. If a loved one has an emergency, we drop everything to help them because it feels like the most important thing we could possibly be doing at that moment. The most potent actions are often done without forethought of publicity. They are sincere and uncalculating, touching us with a kind of naivete. Would the man who stood in front of the tank at Tiananmen have been as potent a symbol if he had made sure that someone was there to photograph it first? And he talks about how he finds that oftentimes the most potent actions are done without the staging of a spectacle or the forethought of publicity. And he says, he references Thich Nhat Hanh's interbeing, and where self and the universe mirror each other, and whatever happens to any being is also happening in some corner of ourselves, that every act we take ripples out to affect the whole world, and eventually comes back out to affect ourselves, but that we can't know. And Rupert Sheldrake calls it the principle of morphic resonance. A change that happens in one place generates the fields of change that causes similar changes to happen everywhere. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a guided meditation before we get into safety, and I will hopefully keep on our timing. So Vine Deloria, who's a Standing Rock Sioux theologian and historian, reminds us of the cyclical time and the ongoing place. It's an ongoing relationship with a place, rather than an arc from the beginning to an inevitable end point, a final judgment, for instance. So there's a lot of fantasies that can come up around that idea of sort of like, will there be a reckoning, and will I have to be reckoned with? So one version that I like to joke about is like, okay, my student loan debts are like, because I've been kind of not making enough money to be able to pay them back for now. And there's a version of the future where like they're like, okay, you did this many years of grad school, you owe this much, you're gonna have to work this deep in the mine to pay it off. And there's a fantasy of it's kind of like a Jordan Peterson bullshit kind of thing where you play out the sort of like, well, I don't know about if we put the women in charge, they're just going to end up killing us. And I think that's a fear that's based on like all the women that were killed over the centuries. I mean, there were 5-6 million witches put to death in Europe over the course of 1,000 years. This weird sort of like, if we flipped it, it's just going to come back to us. Like, I get that. Also, it's assumptions around just the endless vengeance, and which is a lot of what feeds our popular culture as well. So speaking of vengeance, this is what I want you to imagine. There are 26 billionaires who have the same wealth as 3.8 billion of the poorest people on the planet. So 26 billionaires. There are just 100 companies responsible for 70% of climate change. A regular charter bus has typically 56 seats. So in order to fill those buses with these 100 CEOs of those companies and the 26 billionaires who own 3.8 billion people's other wealth, you'd need about 2.25 buses. And if you wanted to fill that third bus with whoever you wanted from the Trump administration or the George W. Bush administration or whoever you want, you can do that, and then you get to decide what to do with the buses. And, the ethically enlightened response there is like, if you drive those buses off of a cliff, for instance, there's just going to be, 200 folks who just immediately take their place. And so how do you actually get to the root of some of those issues? And at the same time, it's an interesting question for me around, it's just a couple people, really. I mean, which isn't to say that we don't have culpability ourselves, but we're not the full-on greed monsters that some folks seem to be compelled by. I want to reference Carolyn Casey here, who offers the discernments of recognizing a con man versus a trickster. She also has a beautiful phrase, which is "woof woof wanna play," which is a nice way of thinking about how we deal with everybody, and also the question, who brought what, which kind of fundamentally gets to like, we all have something to offer here, even if we don't believe that we have common ground, like somebody brought something. And she also says magic is simply a willingness to collaborate with everything. That's a lot of what I do in the school garden too, is encouraging that magic from folks. Okay, so we're going to get into safety, which is another myth. I don't want to say that safety isn't awesome, and safety isn't something that we should be cultivating all the time, because it is. But it's not something that we get to keep, that we're entitled to, that we get to have necessarily. And so I want to open up some of that, because I know that's a hard one. Pema Children says, I used to have a sign pinned up to my wall that read, only to the extent that we expose ourselves over and over again to annihilation can that which is indestructible be found in us. So I used to have a value judgment. You guys can let me know if it's something you recognize, that goes like this. In this generation, there's a responsibility to show up. It's too avoidant currently to just retreat to the woods while there's still a chance to work in the city for justice. But included in this agreement is a clause that just before the city gets too crazy, myself and ideally my closest friends and family, specifically the ones who have money to buy land, can retreat to a magical homestead sanctuary and hold workshops and healing ceremonies and make art that no one sees. And not to knock that choice, because it's definitely an allurement and it may be still something that I do. But it's more than that, actually. My grandfather had to give up his garden when he became a refugee. My dad was able to grow a garden that he was able to plant little trees. The house I grew up in had little trees when my dad planted them that by the time I was there were huge trees towering over the house. And so that was the ability to conceive of, I'm going to plant this, it's going to grow, my kids will still be able to see it and be in that garden and cultivate that land. And that's something that I love and don't really believe in anymore. Moreover, I was, and it's solastalgia. That's an example of solastalgia as well. A little while back, I was talking to a friend at the honey stand about coming to this point where I'm realizing I might need to abandon this whole idea entirely, or at least as much as I need to, because even though we've had snow this week, for instance, there's long-term drought prospects for the Sierras. The Pacific Northwest and the northern woods, where it's like, oh, well, we could sneak up there and probably have a pretty quiet, hidden time. They've been burning. There were 3 million acres in 2018 that were burning in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. That was smoke that stretched all the way to Europe. So more every season, I'm realizing that there's no safe place to live. And my friend responded, yeah, that sounds like a white person thing. So I'm going to quote Audre Lorde, who's a black lesbian, Caribbean American poet and activist. She says, to survive in the mouth of this dragon, we, all America, have had to learn this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive, not as human beings. Neither were most of you here today, black or not. That visibility which makes us most vulnerable is that which is also the source of our greatest strength, because the machine will grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners, mute forever, while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners, mute as bottles, and we still will be no less afraid. And this is a quote from James Baldwin, who's an author, playwright, and cultural critic, and cuts to the heart of the alienation and fundamental lack of acceptance for black folks in America, and the cosmology there. He says, the universe, which is not merely the stars and the moon and the planets, the flowers and the grass and the trees, but other people, has evolved no terms for your existence, has made no room for you. And if love will not swing wide the gates, no other power will or can. And if one despairs, and who has not, of human love, God's love alone is left. But God, and I felt this even then, is white. The passion with which we love the Lord was a measure of how deeply we feared and distrusted and in the end hated almost all strangers, always and avoided and despised ourselves. But I cannot leave it at that. There's more to it than that. In spite of everything, there was in the life I fled a zest and a joy and a capacity for facing and surviving disaster that was very much moving and very rare. Perhaps we were, all of us, pimps, whores, racketeers, church members, and children, bound together by the nature of our oppression, the specific and peculiar complex of risks we had to run. If so, within these limits, we sometimes achieved with each other a freedom that was close to love. So, Black Lives Matter, a movement which was based around the very reminder of the deadly disparity in safety and consideration and the perpetuality of brutality, making each other matter, keeping each other safe is not the same thing as pretending that everything's fine. Though denial is encouraged by the dominant culture. It means supporting safety even and especially when things get out of control. This is also a part of men unlearning ingrained rape culture, the entitlement to dominate, ownership over everyone else's body. I had a manager at a brewery I worked at who would tap people on the genitals as he walked by, just as one example that I happen to be through. Safety that we build every day, working with each other's attachment styles and abandonment issues and all the stuff like that's great. That's such good work. The larger questions of safety, even out to the point of like, there are meteors and asteroids that come and blow up planets all the time. I mean, there's a pretending that we have safety because we've gone this long where we've managed to not get knocked around too much. Okay, so one of the ways also we can respond to that is we can build our bug out bags. We can prepare. So here we are in an earthquake zone. This is actually a liquefaction zone where this building stands. So the ground underneath us is mushy and could kind of melt if we shake it too hard. But there are things that we can do. We can have plans. In our bug out bags, we can put our essentials. We can have pictures of loved ones and sacred objects as the last stuff that we might be carrying around. And the more we practice these scenarios, we can expect to hopefully act calmly and responsibly if and when disastrous events play out around us. Fires, wildfires, aside from the jokes around sweeping the forest, there are actually things that we can do. We can have defensible space around our houses. We can have outdoor sprinklers. We can kind of focus in on the homes as something that would help. Okay, are you guys ready for the third movement? It's the abruptive one. It's as though there's going to be an earthquake in 5 seconds, and you all should act how you're going to act. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wah! Wah! Ah! Okay. You can go back. That was good. Thank you, guys.
I haven't done that since
Wow.
fourth grade.
Okay. Whew! Oh, that was just like a 4-point something. That wasn't so bad. Well, we're gonna have to go check. You guys were good, except you were a little close to the windows. You were under the table. That was great. But also, you kind of knew that was happening. So yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. That was the most disruptive thing we're gonna do. But I get that that's your nervous system that gets all up there, and we are already jacked on our nervous systems a lot, especially if we're living in the city, and we are potentially suffering from compassion fatigue, which is a thing. We are also being confronted by weaponized dread, which you just have to watch the State of the Union as a perfect example of that. These are dominant narratives that encourage us to kind of project ruin. There's a dozen movies that have come out in the last decade where San Francisco is destroyed. You can watch a wave come and knock it out, various monsters, whatever you're into, you can see the place that you live get knocked down. And so it's hard to actually get that out of your mind if that's the images that you're working with. The two words that are new words that I have around that are the precariat, which are like the precarious proletariat. And so I think that's pertinent here because that's part of what we're being forced into. And then the people that are forcing us into that are the cacocracy, not democracy, cacocracy, which is rule by the shittiest. All right, so I just wanted to give you guys those words too because they're fun ones. Okay, there's a couple things about renewal and continuing cycles of samsara and all that, but I'm gonna skip ahead to a question about deserving and entitlement, because some of us may having the question arise around whether we're going to have kids and bring kids into this world, and this idea of is the world a safe place to bring kids or a very unsafe, or is it ever safe? Are there so many different generations who look at the world and go, oh, this isn't looking good, and still want life to continue up until the very last point that it can? This is an Ursula K. Le Guin quote: "For each of us deserve everything, every luxury that was ever piled in the tombs of dead kings, and we each of us deserve nothing, not a mouthful of bread in hunger. Have we not eaten while another starved? Will you punish us for that? Will you reward us for the virtue of starving while others ate? No man earns punishment. No man earns reward. Free your mind from the idea of deserving." She also says, you can go home again so long as you understand that home is a place where you have never been. I was going to quote the first President Bush at the Earth Summit in Rio in '92, saying that the American way of life is not negotiable, and connect that to Obama's first inauguration speech, where he said, we will not apologize for our way of life, nor will we waver in its defense. And and get into the President of the United States as a war criminal just as part of the job description. And then there's another James Baldwin quote about the breakup of the world requires the loss of identity and the end of safety. But as our imagining before we get into avoidance, and I will get into self-care and then the song, and then we'll have some questions. So we're pretty good. So close your eyes, if you will, and imagine yourself in you've managed to get somewhere that you do want to be and live for as long as you can. And your setup is good, but also you can see it's tearing at the seams a bit, like you're having to struggle more to get food. You're not sure that it's going to be going, and you can see the writing on the wall that even this place that you've ended up, where you expected to be okay, isn't probably going to end up being okay. And then here's your friend or your close person who says, hey, I got a ticket to Mars. Or wherever. It doesn't have to be Mars. It could be something like, what is that place? Elysium, the city in the sky with all the elite folks, safe from all the ragamuffins. I'm not sure that's the right way to put it, but all the folks stuck on this dying planet. And you have to decide for you whether you go and take that last ticket and go to that place, or you say you can find I got somebody else who can have that ticket. I think I need to stay here and see it out. Stay here, give myself to the earth, and then actually give myself to the earth ultimately. And I don't begrudge you where your choices are on that, but it's an interesting thing to get into. Okay, avoidance, the name of my talk. Avoid dance. For some of us, it can become a way of life. I might know what I'm talking about on that. It's a challenge having the word avoidance in the title of my talk because there's a built-in excuse not to attend. It's easy to avoid the avoidance event. And there's different scales of procrastination, and there's different repercussions. Audre Lorde describes her daughter saying, tell them about how you're never really a whole person if you remain silent. Because there's always that one little piece inside you that wants to be spoken out. And if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter and hotter. And if you don't speak out, one day it'll just up and punch you in the mouth from the inside. So, silencing or having a voice, showing up or not, there's a lot that go into those choices. It's gendered, for instance. When you look at women-identified professors, scholars, researchers, folks who are showing up in their own work, and male-identified ones, a lot of time the language that the female-identified ones use phrases like finding my voice. And the male counterpoints use phrases like finding the light. And that was also, there's also all this racial aspects. There's all these intersectional aspects. So Black women, for instance, to my understanding, can say, well, women of color have not been silent at the home or showing up for what they need to say, and yet still haven't been heard. And silence can stem from abuse, it can stem from shame, and silence and shame cycles feed each other. There's also silence in the form of Vipassana meditation or Quaker meetings, where it's supportive of the body of peacemaking in the community. But it also can be damaging to the literal body as cancer, for instance, which Audre Lorde, in a speech, The Transforming of Silence into Language and Action, which she wrote when she was first getting a diagnosis of breast cancer, by the way, which is obviously increasing among our population now. That was in '88. She's talking about she's talking about the silence surrounding breast cancer at the time. And what she says is, what I regretted most were my silences. Death is the final silence. My silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you. What are the words you do not yet have? What is it that you need to say? What are the tyrannies that you swallow day after day and attempt to make your own until you sicken and die of them eventually? Still in silence. It is not difference that immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many of these silences that must be broken. I have a little section on the oppression of digital time, but I think you all kind of get that. It's only been a few years, really, since we had these things, and we can all say, 8:05, okay, I gotta rush. But before that, we would kind of be like, yeah, so, yeah. We got a little time-ish, it's fine. James Baldwin quote here, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Most of us are about as eager to change as we were to be born, and go through our changes in a similar state of shock. Carolyn Casey recommends replacing the word trauma with the phrase, my beautiful, dangerous assignment. That we're to make medicine from the poison. And she explores the liberating effect of replacing got to with get to, which I think is great. And she also talks about how got to is outsourced Saturn for those of us with astrological perspectives on that. Whereas get to engages our autonomous enthusiasm at the generous opportunity before us. Joanna says, don't wait till you're fully prepared. You never are. And in these moments of pregnant pause, that whole cosmoses foam into existence from the field of potential and you're not sure what to do. My recommendation, and one of the things that's helped me, is to slow down that avoidant attachment. Where does it show up in your tissues? Where does it linger after you've avoided? For me, it's often in my shoulders, but then also right next to my shoulders, ready to pounce with no, too little, too late, every chance it gets. And if it's too little, too late, what point is there, right? But there's also creative catalysm, which is one of the things we learned in this program. We've talked about the sort of cosmic powers of things like Theia, which is the Mars-sized planet crashing into the Earth to make the moon. Things like the cataclysmic breach of Lake Corcoran, which was the lake out in the valley, in the San Joaquin Valley, before it burst and allowed this estuary to form. So in that dramatic sort of gushing forth, all of the meeting of salt water and fresh water that allows all these species to arise, that whole ecosystem was formed. Okay. As we get into self-care, I want to quote the Nauru foreign minister, Kairon Keke. That's one of the island nations. And this was at one of the climate talks a few years ago. Those who are obstructing and self-serving need to realize we are not talking about impacts on how comfortable you people live, but whether or not our people will live at all. So here's our imagining before we go into self-care. Close your eyes if you will. Thank you. Just opening your front door and the water's right there. Just having that. If you'll open your eyes and you'll look out the windows here, I'll go over here and see if the owl will follow me. We can look out on this landscape and imagine the changes over all these eons, the shallow seas that were here, the giant sloths that moved around. One of the questions, I had an image, if we had the projector, of the San Francisco archipelago, which is a map of 100 feet sea level rise, which is about 5 stories, and I'm not sure of exactly, where we're going to land, but it might be that you could open this window and have the ocean rush in at a certain point. And so just sort of holding all of that. Archipelago is also a part of a song that I wrote about different land masses where the land meets the sea, and there's a part where it goes, how do I go away from archipelagos? And there's a part that goes, it's a peninsula. And there's a part that goes, is this an isthmus? And, just want to throw that in. Okay. Self-care. The quote that comes up most often is the Audre Lorde quote, which is, caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And that is from A Burst of Light and Other Essays from 1988. There's a New Yorker article from last year which elucidates the history of self-care in this country, which has seen a resurgence since the 2016 election, of course. He brings it back to Socrates inviting young men, in this case, not to attempt political leadership until they've attended to themselves. And then a self-cultivated individual was used by early Americans to qualify for full citizenship, as well as justify slavery, because, well, these folks can't take care of themselves, so you're going to have to do things for them. It was used to argue against women's suffrage. It was used to argue against food stamps. It refers to sort of a whole groups of people as lazy. And then you not only have to self-care and care for yourself, but you have to prove it. You have to perform it in order for it to count in this country. And then somewhere along the lines of the last few years, it becomes this sort of white women spiritually bypassing billion-dollar industry, where it's all about spa days and hashtag mindfulness, hashtag wellness, optimizing our self-care through hacks, all that weird stuff. So that brings me to our self-care stickers, which I brought, and you can see some of the stickers. You guys can pick as many stickers as you want, because who cares? They came from China. And I was able to go, oh, that's a good, I should pass out something. Bloop, bloop. And now they're here. And so who cares? Right? Or not, depending on whether I'm perpetuating some of this. Oh, thank you, Matt. There's some great questions around what happens if you feel triggered, dissociated, depersonalized, or derealized. That's Jace Har, a trans man who framed a self-care questionnaire. So there are ways that this shows up as an actual sort of way to tune in on what you need, and witnessing and honoring each other's unique vulnerabilities to the extent that we're able to honor our own. But the danger is focusing solely on personal work and neglecting the systematic oppressions which are causing us harm. Adrienne Marie Brown, who has worked here but currently is based out of, I believe, Detroit, also reminds us to lift up disabled and chronically ill folks who have been inventing the art of collective self-care because they've had to live interdependently for a long time. So Blue Buchanan, who's a black genderqueer unionista and grad student, says stepping back should always be temporary. Self-care should be oriented away from simply pleasure towards healing in its many and difficult forms. Adrienne Maree Brown says, what is truth? Trauma makes weapons of us, and fools and secret keepers and collaborators in harm. We must learn what is worth our attention and how powerful our attention is. We must get more passionate about healing than we are about punishment. And I have a thing about our willingness to sacrifice our children to guns and to detention camps and to an uninhabitable future and sacrifice zones. And these questions of how we can be expected to sacrifice ourselves. Because part of where this goes to and plays out for folks is like and this is Arnie Nass's fourth principle of deep ecology, which holds that the flourishing of human life and cultures is compatible with the flourishing of life and cultures is compatible with a substantial decrease of the human population. The flourishing of non-human life requires such a decrease. And there are different ways that sacrifice and atonement can show up. The feminist philosopher Kellyanne Hackney Pudner lists self-immolation, which is not literally, but destroying one's own autonomy, self-abnegation, which is disowning one's autonomy, self-effacement, which is devaluing one's autonomy, and self-donation, which is dedicating one's autonomy. The last one being actually a higher realization of including everybody. And Vine Deloria, who I mentioned before, a Standing Rock Sioux theologian and historian, asserts that Western concepts of forgiveness and repentance for sins, a few Hail Marys and you're good, are far too quick and easy for our current culminating miscarriages of justice. Lewis Hyde, author of The Gifts, reminds us that to atone is to reunite, to make at one. There was a time when a criminal was allowed and expected to atone for his crimes with a gift. So I'll just say, before I do my song, because I'm going to do my song next, and then we'll get a little bit of time to get into some of this last questions. For those of you who are astrologically inclined, I'm a Capricorn sun, and I have a Cancer moon, and I have a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and so I have some drive to attend to despair, to working with this stuff, to have availability for some of these harder questions. And for me, I think what's helpful is things like gardening and tuning into the seasons and the solstices and equinoxes, seeing the crescent moon before it's set on my way here. Always sort of register, like giving a little prayer of thanks to the Golden Gate Bridge and that little window where it's like 45% of the state's water pours through that little channel. It's the only way with that all of this energy that we accumulate here can escape out into the ocean, and that the ocean energy can come through. So it's like this little hint of eternity right there. And I always am like, hey, thank you. It's got to see you again. And I tend to do that with the mountain peaks around and all that stuff, and just kind of like situating myself there. But I'm also able to I'm able to prioritize not hustling, which comes from certain privileges. There's a balance that allows me to to be present enough that I can recognize, okay, I'm freaking out, and that means I actually haven't been breathing, and I'm suddenly turning around and I have shortness of breath, and what'll help with that? Certain movement modalities, Rosen method or Pilates, certain like hot and cold showers, things that kind of like draw you back into your body and kind of enliven you. Jocelyn, who's a food activist with the People's Kitchen Collective, and a friend of mine, she says, when we were discussing all this stuff, she says, yeah, I've just been doing very small things, which I really liked. Okay, I'm going to do my song, and I am going to have an album coming out this year, if I can do it. I have this little setup here. And I'll do my best. You guys can dance if you want, or you can just shimmy, or you can do it as you like. I will do my best, and then we'll close with a few quotes and questions. If anybody needs to leave at 8:30 on the dot, you can. But I have these bay nut truffles and bay nuts that if you leave before I tell you what they are, you won't even know. These are the bay leaves, if you want to recognize those. Okay.
Bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Survival, bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Survival, bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Survival, bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Survival, bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Survival, bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Survival, bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Survival, bless us all, bless us all. Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. How many times will you come through? Arrival, bless us all, bless us all. Come through. She left the nest, she failed the test, she did your best, you remember the rest. But when your memory's back, it's so long ago, still find it. As our allies run to the prize, rolling stop, just enjoy doing the voyage of dance. Of dance of dance of yeah, that was it, yeah. Dance. Whatever you can do that boy dance if you want. Dance. Dance. How about now? How about now? How about now? Oh, when is the right time for this shit to end? How about now? I thought it was over, we go again. How about now? Oh, when is the right time for this shit to end? I thought it was over, we go again. About now, when is the right time? When is the right time? When is the right time my fruit can be free? I'll plant one more tree, but not for me. This is all, this is all. Arrive on, this is all, this is all. Survive on, this is all, this is all. Arrive on, this is all, this is all.
Okay. So I'm going to hand these out while we go through the last little bit together. These are bay laurel nuts. They grow all over. You can recognize them by these leaves, which have an aromatic. So if you rub the leaves together We'll say that. You can't smell it, owl, but it's. I was like, no, I can't. You're just teasing me. So I'm gonna give you both the weird squishy truffles that I made, which are vegan and have a little sprinkling of different spices, but it's just these ground up and coconut oil and salt and dark honey, for local honey. And then this is the original. So if you need to, is that?
Thank you.
And I'll start this one over here maybe. This is a Gazongo nutcracker, so you might use the little one there or something. But yeah. And maybe have one. They're pretty strong. They're chocolate. We roasted them until they're that color. They need to be dried. Yeah. Is it okay?
Really good.
Oh, good. Okay. But I wouldn't have too many because they have caffeine and they have a little bit of a diuretic thing if you have a bunch. But you'll be okay. You'll be okay at this rate. I think you'll be all right. So with just a few minutes left, I wanted to hit with some gems about what we're trying to do here, and then I would love to hear where you guys are. Ongoingness is something that we all care about. Being ongoing, even if it, beyond us. Donna Haraway reminds us to stay with the trouble, to cultivate kin in the thick present. James Baldwin reminds us of the law that we recognize when we say whatever goes up must come down, a cosmic vengeance. And here we are at the center of the arc, trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. And then he also says, one must say yes to life and embrace it wherever it is found. And it is found in terrible places. For nothing is fixed forever and ever. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born. And we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have. The sea rises. The light fails. Lovers cling to each other. And children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. Ursula K. Le Guin, now this is a hard one for me because I always want to end it on love and okay, we're just going to all love each other, right? She says, which I still believe, but she says, it is our suffering that brings us together. It is not love. I want one. Oh, yeah, they're good. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, okay, great. Well, you should all go home with some and make things with them because we have a bunch. Okay, it is not love that brings us together. It is suffering. Love does not obey the mind, and it turns to hate when forced. The bond that binds us is beyond choice. We are brothers and sisters. We are brothers and sisters in what we share, in pain, which each of us must suffer alone, in hunger, in poverty, in hope. We know our brother and sisterhood. We know it because we've had to learn it. We know it because there's no help for us but from one another. There is no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand. And the hand that you reach out is empty, as mine is. You have nothing, you possess nothing, you own nothing, you are free. All you have is what you are and what you give. Stephen Jenkinson reminds us, and I said this to the kids when the chicken died yesterday, which was a little bit like direct, but it's in the garden, it's a good context because it really does, you don't get gardens without all the death that feeds the life there. Stephen Jenkinson says, when we love someone and we love their life, we can also love their death. And he reminds us, what does your death feed? I also wanted to bring up that Mary Oliver poem, You Don't Have to Walk 1,000 miles. You just have to love what your, I'm paraphrasing it, but love what your furry body. I love that one, and it's a hard one too, because it really gets to the sort of like, is that really all you have to do? You just have to love what your body loves, and you don't have to walk 1,000 miles in the desert repenting. And I think it's not, doesn't land so easily as like, yes, okay, there might be things that you have to repent for. There might be pilgrimages of atonement, and that doesn't mean that that's not included in what you love. So I want to turn it over to you guys around this question of how much must change. Adrienne Maree Brown has a line tattooed on her left arm, which is all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And so she says a big part of her work is to ask, how are you willing to let yourself be changed? How are you willing to continue to ask questions from a place of not knowing? And this is what we can learn from flocking, when birds flock. How do we stay the right distance apart and the right distance in touch with each other in order to actually move together as a unit and stay alive and make it as far as we can? So I want to ask you guys, what gives you reassurance? Who are the people in your lives that you see making choices that allow you to believe in a livable future? I was walking with Ari last week, and one of the things we were imagining is like, okay, if my 2020 self was talking to my 2010 self about what things are like, and I said something, just as an example, something like, well, this person bragged about sexual assault and was still elected, and then said that 5,000 people who died from a hurricane in Puerto Rico weren't actually dead, that it was just a Democratic conspiracy, and then has put 12,000 people, kids and counting, in cages. I think my 2010 self would say, that's terrible. What are the repercussions of that? What is going to happen as a result of that? And my 2019 self doesn't know. But I wonder if my 2030 self knows. I wonder if my 2030 self has something to say about repercussions. And not just repercussions, but also love and continuing and ongoingness, and what allows us to get up every morning and believe in life and have the intimacies and the small and big triumphs that we have. So what are you seeing that's working for you guys, that seems like it's of benefit, of continuance, life affirming in the death cycle, as our friend Audre says? And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. We can just pass questions back and forth until you guys need to go. It's 8:30 now, so we're pretty done. But I want to have time for you guys too. Oh, and wait, okay. We have one last, okay, stand up. We have one last movement. It'll just take a second, and that'll be our close. And then we can do whatever. Okay, arms like this again. And we're remembering that we made our boundary and we did the trees with the mycological networks. This time I want you to float a little bit like this because you're in space. And you are Laniakea, the supercluster of galaxies. You are made of 100,000 points of light, which are all galaxies filled with 1 billion stars each. And all of your galaxies and light and life is flowing towards towards your heart, because that's the great attractor in the sky. It's a place of more mass that attracts all the galaxies around it like a star shed. And so you're feeling all of this light and life pouring towards your center, your heart center from your appendages. And out here on your left hand, right in the thick, fleshy part of your, under your thumb there. I don't know the technical, do you know what that's called? Okay. So that part, that's where the Milky Way is. That's where we are. And that's true. In Laniakea, in our supercluster of galaxies, we are way out, this long arm, away from the great attractor, away from the heart of the supercluster. And it's kind of a lonely country road. There's not much going on out there. There's a whole bunch of action over here, but this is kind of quiet. And as Laniakea, you realize, wait a second, this is a let's say, almond Milky Way galaxy. And they actually would get along really well. Okay, we're going to put them together. So really slowly, over eons, I want you to get these two galaxies, in this fleshy part of your galaxy hand and this fleshy part, bring them closer. And while you're doing that, there's all the stuff going on. The Milky Way merges with Andromeda and becomes Milkdromeda. The sun expands and swallows the inner planets. Hopefully we bounce out to an outer planet, but then it shrinks back into become crystallized, like a white crystal ball floating in the sky, which is also what honey does when it gets colder. But then for those of us who make it all the way to this point, reunited. Oh, we get to be together. And who would have thought along that long journey that this would happen? But it turns out that there's longer stories at work that we can just love and be grateful to be a part of. Okay, so thanks. Okay, so any questions for you? I'd love to hear what, as part of the sense making that we're doing, what you feel like is especially good or especially bad, whatever you guys want to share.
One of each. Green New Deal seems like long shot, but there's
Green
a lot
New Deal,
of
yeah.
momentum that's Alexander Ocasio-Cortez just released like more details about it today.
Yeah,
I was reading it, and it sounds really great.
Good.
And it's not like huge centralized environment bureaucracy in Washington that decides everything. It's all about sending money and resources to local communities so that because that's where the action is and the people know what to do in their local communities.
Yeah, totally.
And have you guys read about this? These studies that are being done on the way that particulate matter in the atmosphere, like from pollution, coal-fired plants, airplanes, it seeds clouds. And that reflects sunlight, which has been keeping the planet cooler than it otherwise would be, given the amount of greenhouse gas that's been released. So, as we improve our energy infrastructure and close down all the coal, as we stop flying airplanes so much, the particulate matter is going to lessen. Great, clean skies, fewer clouds. We're going to warm up a lot faster than we even realized. So it's like, and the climate's really complex.
Yeah.
And so, in so many ways, it's worse than we think, and we don't know what we're not seeing yet that might make it not as bad. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
What do you think about the Green New Deal? Have you looked into it much?
There was a Green New Deal, I don't know if it's called exactly the same thing, but there was a version of it in the 90s that this new one, at least I didn't see today, but the original way that they were talking about it didn't reference that one. And so the concern was that it was kind of still perpetuating the, okay, but as long as it doesn't mess with the economy and da-da-da-da-da. And obviously it would benefit the economy in so many ways because there's so many opportunities to help, and those could be paying too. But yeah, anything that has enthusiasm behind it, really.
We still have a year left in this decade.
We don't have a year left in the decade. It's February 7th.
10 months.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, we're gonna keep going. I suspect we have a little bit of time, but we got to do it. Anybody else?
think for me, the thing that makes all the difference is developing a relationship with something bigger than my own survival, or even the survival of our species. Like, what do we care about that's bigger than survival? 'Cause it seems like fixating on survival, even as the positive goal, how do we get sustainable? It still feeds that attitude that like what matters is just perpetuating this.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's something about that seems like it's fucked inherently. Like we've lost sight of something bigger than that we can then sacrifice, that we can put on the altar.
Yeah.
And I guess for me, it just feels like that really changes the feeling about like trying to get out of the situation or dying uselessly. And I don't know, I feel like that conversation is something that we're all participating in. It's like, what is there that's bigger than that? But it feels to me like there's like a beautiful form of creativity in that, because we don't necessarily know what those answers are.
Yeah.
But I think it reframes a lot of the issues around like, what are we doing?
It's still hard to imagine giving up comforts, and I mean, Northern California is like one of the most comfortable places in the whole world, and I don't want to. At the moment, I don't want to give that up, and I'm actually associating more with being a Californian than I am with being an American, for instance, right now. And like you say, there's also being an Earthling, being maybe a Laniakean, having Laniakeanship. Like, there are bigger things. There are ancient things. There's a lot of ways we can tune in, but that does mean holding the rest of it a little more gently, at least, or learning how to let go more fundamentally. But that's scarier, and sometimes it just happens. It doesn't matter if it's scary. Yes.
Yeah, I think for me, what came up was the untapped potential of imagination, because I feel like the tendency to orient ourselves towards survival can limit us. Like, we can only think so far, but our imagination is unlimited, and I feel like there's things that we have not imagined that can bring us better things than what we have, or bring us something. So I feel like it's that capacity of breaking through or looking past what's unique to tap into what's infinite, and our mind alone has that capacity. So
Do you think that that's available when you're in survival mode?
I've thought about this. I think it's always available, but it's not taught that it's available. Most people, and this is something I was thinking about a lot, just working in education in low-income communities in San Francisco, is that students are not taught to think that way. They're taught, it's just perpetuated. I think more children or more people need to be taught that's an inherent power that we all have, I think, regardless of your circumstance. And it makes me think of this one book. It's called The Sun Does Shine, I think, by, I forget the author, but he was a Black man who was incarcerated for 30 years, and he was for a crime he didn't commit, and he was talking about how he found so much joy just in his own mind. So in his mind, he married like Halle Berry or something, he found, and that gave him, like, when he left, he was like, I did so many things when I was there, so he found a liberation internally. And it's tragic that that's his experience that he has to have, but I think that that's something to reflect on, is that our liberation is already possessed, but we don't tap into that as often.
Totally. It also reminds me of having some maybe compassion, maybe forgiveness for some of our ancestors who didn't treat each other that well when they were escaping for their lives. I mean, I have direct family members who were abusive, and it's not an excuse for their behavior, but they also were trying to live in that moment. So they didn't have such a great time being nice and figuring out how to word everything in a nonviolent way and all this stuff. So, okay, like, if I'm still doing healing work for that, or my family lineage is, how do we fit that into sort of like, well, I don't have to hold on to that because that's not my experience now, but it's a lineage that I'm part of, and it could come back that I get into survival mode if things become more fascist or more terrible, whatever. So having that kind of connection to, like, these were people, like, they had legitimate things. The women who had violent anger in my family had reason to be violently angry, Doesn't mean that we don't have to work it out afterwards, but it's a thing that we all have our lives and our journeys and are doing the best we can, hopefully. And I'm interested in what allows people to connect to those larger stories, those deeper time and sort of larger bodily awareness. Mishi?
Somewhat tied to Ursula Le Guin's quote at the end.
Yeah.
And something that I find solace in some way kind of inspiring kind of frame is the four noble truths.
Yeah.
And that is, for those that aren't aware, the way that I learned it, the first noble truth is to be human is to suffer. And the second is desire causes suffering. The third, there is a way through that. And the fourth, the way that I learned it, this is from Stephen Goldman, is through the Dharma or philosophy. And so I return to that because it makes, like, the cluster that you laid out for us, that's like the ground. That's like the suffering. It's not the background. It's like how we know and we live. And if we're at all tapped into these ideas, if we're all connected to our ecology, if we're like sentient that way, then we are thinking in those terms that there's suffering all around us and we're connected to that.
And we're eating it and we're doing, we're interconnected with it.
Right, yeah. Right. And then, Natalie, actually, when you were speaking about imagination, I thought that is also a large part of philosophy, like imagining what can be done here, what is in my means to act, and I think about skillful means, and I think about how is it that I can acclimate my nervous system to the world, and with all of this knowledge, right, the detail of it, that invokes in me this, like, sometimes fear, sometimes, like, just overwhelm and kind of like, fuck it.
Yeah.
How can I do anything about this?
Yeah, paralysis.
Right?
Yeah.
Paralysis, yes.
Yeah.
And if I can, like, have a quote and I can meet people that are talking about these ideas and like investigate the Green New Deal, you know, and like listen to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that there's a kind of like skill in having that as a resource, this knowledge that there are allies, that there is wisdom, that there are traditions that have situated like the experience of being alive. It's like, yeah, we're gonna suffer.
Right.
And how can you like and there are ways to respond to that.
It reminds me of Ilhan Omar casually throwing out, and we'll get rid of student loan debt, and just like, it's like, of course we are, because that's the, why would we have everybody be burdened by all that? Just the sort of seeing people who have already stepped into the next ways that we're showing up for each other, even when we're connected to the suffering that's ongoing. Yeah. Thanks. Mega?
Thanks. I just want to say that I really appreciated this space tonight because I've really been thinking about a lot of these things since the fall. And this person that I know sent me an email, and a couple other people. She now lives in Brazil, but I used to be housemates with her, and it was kind of this email that was like warning that there was this premonition and this dream and a big earthquake was coming, and like it would hit here and it would be the magnitude of all the suffering, which I was like, okay, so that's ginormous.
Right.
What can we do? And me and like a lot of people in my community that we shared this information with you know, it's a big question of like, okay, we don't know what's gonna happen, and the threat, the reality, like the possibility is always there, and do we choose to go or do we choose to stay? And what is our role and what is our responsibility in going or staying? And in the end, we all made our bags, you know, and like got a lot more prepared and like took it a lot more seriously. And it was really interesting that it took this thing, this like outside source, to get to have us do that. But kind of since then, I've been just like thinking about all of this, and then the fires came shortly after, and I really appreciate just the way that you like had this space and just brought in a lot of different people that I have read in bits and pieces, but how you connected it to these bigger questions, and just, I don't know necessarily like answered anything, but just kind of like, I don't know, just like felt like a little less alone in like this process of like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
You know, and what does moving forward even look like? And I really like to question and about effectiveness and just bringing that in. Because so much, you know, I say that so much too, like I want my communication to be effective. And just like that idea of, well, what does that actually really mean? Because I don't really know how someone will really, how they interpret how I feel or what I say, how it makes them feel.
Never
Is
know.
that my responsibility or is it, you know?
Right.
So just just having that not really be such the focus is something that I'm gonna play with more now. And
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm so grateful that you have that feeling of not alone as much, because I think that's a major thing, and that comes from, you know, that quote at the beginning where it's like, we're not here to save the world, we're just here to tune in to how what we're doing affects each other and how you're doing with all that. And I'm wondering if you have a sense, or if any of you have a sense of like, does this seem like a workshop that could work in different communities where like folks are kind of asked, like, because I don't think there are necessarily answers beyond showing up for it and asking the questions together. But I don't want it to be this kind of rarefied, elitist grad school sort of like, we all get to kind of spin out intellectually or even do some embodied somatic stuff, and then it doesn't actually like get us on the ground sort of having a effective change in our lives. So it's just a question. I want to kind of keep having this organically develop, but if anybody has a sense of like whether it felt on the one hand or the other hand available for folks, for multiple folks.
I could say, I think just on the subject of skillful means, it probably depends on who your audience is. I'm sure I've also had read a lot, not a whole lot, but I was familiar with terms that you were using, but I think, again, depending on who you're speaking to, it might be confusing.
Sure.
But I think like the general format is really affirmative and like lures people, or at least lured myself into into just the presence and a feeling of not being alone. So I just, it was fantastic.
I'm glad.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job bringing in all the elements like embodiment, food. I've never had that before. And just introducing tension and then releasing that. I think all that was really effective. And just something I've been thinking a lot about is in a space like this, or in an educational space, how do we decentralize the space?
Yeah.
So I think that's especially important in communities of color where they're often not given that space. So, and you're doing that really well right now, just introducing dialogue, but I think that maybe doing that throughout so that different communities can feel like they can speak, and like people have like offer so much just from their own experiences in any room. So I feel like it's always, there's maybe at other times to bring that in too, but
Definitely.
I felt, yeah, you're really good at bringing all those elements in.
It was probably too full. So I thank you for saying that. It's just the first session, so I'm trying to like figure out what's essential and what's.
I'll share what Erica.
Oh yes, please. We have people there. Hello, hello.
Erica said, I think you could guide inquiry into each topic with any community and create the space for their own response. But it would have to be what is your response and not expecting a specific outcome.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Erica. That's completely right, of course, as usual. Yeah. Does anybody else?
I think that this feels to me like it, I want this to be a whole day with you.
Yeah, maybe.
Like,
Yeah, that's probably right.
because it does feel like,
Long weekend with some.
yeah,
Yeah.
with hot tubs.
I don't know what this is. Hot tub.
But that there's like, like you were just sharing that I think there'd be such valuable conversation at each stopping point, and that in a way it's really hard to take in that information without having a chance to
be with it.
let it like move.
Yeah.
And so I think things like just take 5 minutes and talk to your neighbor about how you deal with safety, efficacy, all that stuff would be enormously helpful. Sort of like I think by the end I felt like dammed up, like I couldn't take in more because it was just full. And I recognize when you bring so much amazing gems of wisdom from all over and weaving it together in this epic way, it just feels like more time.
Yeah. And also you can like have a truffle and see how you do with it, and then you can fill up with more truffles. Yeah.
I'll just piggyback on Ari here. At times, there was so much rich information and so much, like you said, hard information to really hold and take in, that I found myself going into this space of what have I even done, doing, kind of feeling everything kind of just start shutting down, what am I even thinking about, what am I reading about, why this feels frivolous in a sense, and how does this coagulate?
Yeah.
And so I think that having this kind of space to, not that we can really fully have the space in a day or maybe even a weekend to let this sink in, but you have so much rich information, and I don't know if it's about eliminating some of it or maybe boiling some of it down in, I don't want to say a more digestible package because I think the impact is great, but thinking about the time frame and what can be absorbed is so different depending on who you're engaging with.
Sure.
But that was my experience during some of the time, so much richness and also kind of
Yeah. I get that way too, and it's really understandable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a response because you love this earth and you love all the people and the animals and you care about them and it's a judgy thing to think that something's frivolous, but there's a range of actions that we take every day and choices that we make, and some of them are self-absorbed and some of them are about engaging, and it's just our lives. And I wouldn't say drop everything that is meaningful if it doesn't have these effects, because we're letting go of effectiveness, but or not letting it go entirely, but just.
I feel like also to also piggyback on what you were saying, that thought of the idea of stepping into something that really is moving for you from a heart space and not being so linked with the effectiveness of it felt really powerful, because it just reminded me that if you can make one connection with one person, even just at one point, that's of value. And going back to that idea of intimacy, which is, I feel so diminishing in our culture in so many ways, like that's evoking and creating like a moment of intimacy in a sense and digging in deeper. So I appreciated that.
And I think that's what it's all about. Adrienne Marie Brown's her book, Emergent Strategies, has a lot of that around, hey, it's about your close relationships. That's what will actually affect change ultimately. More than sort of trying to have a wide range of superficial, like, you know, encouragements or whatever. Thanks. Yeah, man.
I also just wanted to say, as far as like
Thanks for-
taking this on, like continuing to share it. I know that you had a projector, and I don't know what you had intended to put on it, but like definitely showing images of the people that whose quotes you share.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
would really help people like connect with that material and like get an idea of who it's coming from, especially if they don't already have an idea of what that person looks like or who they are, would really be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
As well as like, I love when you share this whole thing is your art and your creativity and your like passion,
Well,
but also when you share your song
good.
and like opening up space. Obviously it would be too much in 2 hours, but if you had a longer time to do it, inviting other people to do
Oh,
so
yeah.
I think would be really
Definitely,
rich and would really help people to not only like take in, but also to
Release some of it,
release
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Thank you for all the feedback, guys. Can I ask you before we close, if there are sort of lodestar grounding folks in your lives, people who, or situations, or you said the Green New Deal, but if there are inspiring folks who make you believe that you'll live to see elderhood, you know? Just wondering. Like, if you look at your life and you see somebody who is doing things that, like, you think are actually sustainable and potentially carry the strength to kind of make it. I mean, would not to say that things don't, you know, knock you over, but that somebody who can kind of work it.
No, I mean, I kind of felt this way. I'm taking this class called Narratives of the Oppressed in the Women's Sexuality Program, and the professor named Jessica. But she said she just turned 70, and I was like, she was really good. And she was just saying how she's gone through a really difficult life, and all of us have gone through like tons in different ways. But she just introduced like song and dance, and she did this whole grounding thing, and I just saw this energy around her that felt like elder wisdom, and it was nice being around that because I don't see that a lot, especially with women of color. I don't see it as often. So that was just because it happened yesterday. So it was really cool.
That's cool.
Yeah.
A lot of the 70-year-olds look pretty young right now.
Yeah.
That whole boomer generation is like, oh, you're going to keep going forever, huh? Okay. Using it all up, I guess. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was really inspired. I had the good fortune last summer to be in circle with Jean Shinoda Bolin, who's a female Jungian. She's in Marin, and she's I think almost 90.
Mm-hmm.
She's lived a long time, and her vitality and just the way she has. Just the way she continues to show up in life has been really inspiring. And I also feel really sad that it took me so long to think of even one single person. And I think like this community, at least for me, the PCC community as a whole, is the first thing that came to mind. But I struggled to think about. I struggled to come up with a pinpoint the date off the cuff.
Yeah.
So that's real too.
Sure. Yeah.
For me.
Yeah.
one of the elders that inspires me a lot is Martin Prechtel, and what I've learned from him, one of the things is I think his feeling that it's whether I make it to elderhood is not the point. That collectively, that we actually can create a seed jar that has viable seeds for a time beyond our own, and that us making it across the finish line is that may not belong to us in this generation, but that we can really do a lot for those who will come after, come through, who will then be looking around going like, what? Okay, so we know a lot about what didn't work. What might actually be viable?
Right.
And I think the seeds that we're cultivating here might be really useful for that. So I think like doing that work feels important beyond my making it.
Yeah, the planting seeds for a hopeless harvest kind of like you don't know, but you still do it. You still pass it through. Yeah, that's really powerful. Yeah. Did you have something to say, Matt?
I was just going to presence that the operations staff
Wants us to
thankful
leave.
if we leave by 9:30. So
Okay.
in terms of cleanup and stuff,
Okay, we can close.
we're getting there.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they want to presence before we?
I would just like to
Ongoing
present how much gratitude I have for the quality of relationships I've come into here, this moving here. A little more than a year ago, I just never felt so. There's just so much patience and just in what you expressed about concern about the response of others and also whether or not it's your responsibility and
Right.
just that being so present between so many individuals is, I think, something I'm really grateful for.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Glad to be doing this. Okay, take some of these. Oh, great. You don't want any more stickers or so? You don't need, you know all this stuff already.
Your kids.
Yeah, I'll give it to the kids, yeah. Although WTF, I don't think they're.
I'm gonna let you share these
That's
with
my
your
note.
kids.
Okay.
Thank you though.
Of course. No.
Do you just find these out in the wild?
Oh, I didn't tell the story about those. Another garden teacher who I know has a stash, or basically knew where there were kind of like a whole bunch of aloe trees. Where it's off, nobody goes there. And it felt very like, what? And actually there was a coyote on the path ahead of me who felt like they're
Guiding, they were